Welcome everybody to this research seminar, including Tim Campbell. Welcome. Okay, I'm very happy to have Nicola Mulkeen here. We're going to speak about exploitation and time, future generations, social roles, and structural injustice. Future generations, we're quite interested in that here at the Institute for Future Studies. So you are a lecturer in political philosophy at Newcastle University, and you got your PhD in political philosophy from 2017 from University of Manchester on dissertation on socially constructed luck and exploitation. And nowadays your focus is primarily on intergenerational justice. Hence, very fitting to have you here.
Thank you.
And you published a lot recently about this, power and future people's freedom, and treating young and old as equals, and similar papers. So you're very welcome.
Thank you. And thank you very much for having me. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today is exploitation and time. So this comes from a book that I've just about finished, but I'm in the editing process of it. The aim of the book is to put forward an intertemporal account of exploitation. So it's looking at how exploitation functions at discrete points in time. And I identify 4 different types of exploitation. So one is between birth cohorts or generations. One is between age groups. One is looking at exploitation over an individual's lifespan. So how exploitation can affect people at certain points and how it can disappear, and for others it can compound. And also exploitation between different social groups. So how is it that members of social groups, such as women or minorities, somehow just end up victims of exploitation throughout time? And then the second half of the book looks at what to do about it. And here I look at like democracies and constitutions. And the hope is that it contributes to the debate on exploitation, which tends to have like very static theories of exploitation. They don't really look at the time aspect, and particularly how our institutions function over time. So I try and bring that dimension to those theories. And then also I hope to contribute to intergenerational justice as well, and just show why exploitation is important. I don't think it's the most important concept, but I do think it's one that's missing at the moment. And I just want to try and convince you that actually exploitation is something that should be brought to the table and should be thought about more. Right, okay, so what I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes or so is share insights from a chapter on age-based exploitation. I'm going to focus on how older age groups exploit younger age groups. And I'm just going to explain the conception of exploitation that I'm using, how it works, apply this to age relations, and then look at a key example involving military conscription as well. And I think it's quite timely because we might be about to enter a world war. So hopefully it'll be relevant for what we're doing. So the first thing is, what is exploitation? So exploitation is just notoriously complex. It involves transactions that are bilateral. So you've got goods and services that just travel in both directions. It's mutually beneficial, so it can make both parties better off than they would be from the non-transaction baseline. And it's also consensual in the sense that no parties are necessarily deceived in any way, or nor does it contravene their express wishes. And because of these features, it often seems like there's nothing problematic with exploitation. This is just exactly the same features as you'd find when you're buying a cup of coffee. So the question is, what is wrong with exploitation? And that's at the heart of the exploitation debate. And different theorists come up with different ideas or arguments as to why a particular wrong-making feature really gets to the heart of it. And this ranges from unfair advantage, harm, lack of reciprocity, a lack of reasonable alternative when people's backs are up against the wall, past injustice, disrespect, domination, coercion, or some kind of attitude failure as well. This also coheres with disrespect, but it can also be like knowledge or awareness of what people are doing. And what I try and put forward is what's known as exploitation over time. So a model that helps us to capture what goes on. And part of the intertemporal model has 2 conditions. So one of them is background injustice. And when I look at background injustice, that is very structural in nature. And also I try to plug in the moral responsibility of the exploiter who extracts benefits from somebody who is a victim of background injustice as well. So there's two key features. One is background injustice. The other is somebody who is morally responsible for extracting benefits from a victim in a way that they do it if they extract more than would have been the case if the victim hadn't been a victim of injustice. So I'll just go into this in a little bit more detail because I said that quite quickly. So background injustice is systemic conditions that deny people opportunities that they would have had in a just society. And this happens through like active violations of justice. So it might be that people are in poverty or they don't have what's needed to satisfy their basic needs. So it lacks a principle of sufficiency. So it might be that rights to education are missing. They don't have security, various things like that. But it also counts as a failure to prevent foreseeable injustice through inaction as well. And why this matters is that it's failures, if they're avoidable, then this is obviously something that's a governance failure. It's not just something that's luck or something that's happened. It's something that our structures are doing. And I think that's really important to be able to capture it. And then there's also moral responsibility and liability. And here I borrow quite a bit from Jeff McMahan's account of moral responsibility and liability that he uses, particularly when he looks at it in war situations or he looks at it in ethics of killing debate. And following Jeff, what I think works is responsibility lies on a spectrum. So there are key factors that influence how morally responsible you are by degree. So this can include things like causation. So did you contribute to an injustice? Did you have knowledge or intent? So could you foresee an injustice and you chose to go ahead with it anyway? Did you have reasonable alternatives that could have somebody or a body or a being could have acted differently? And then also proportionality. So just depending on how involved you are in terms of causation, knowledge or reasonable alternatives, if you hit any of these quite strongly, like you had lots of reasonable alternatives, then it seems that your degree of moral responsibility increases. And then attached to that moral responsibility by degree attaches to liability. And by liability, I just mean straightforwardly that somebody is accountable for their actions. We can hold them into account and say, look, you're morally responsible for what you've done. And the reason that moral responsibility matters, I think, is it allows us to identify exploiters and distinguish them from people who just happen to benefit from injustice. So an exploiter is someone different. It's not just somebody who benefits, but it's someone who bears responsibility. So it might be employers, policymakers, or investors. And greater responsibility for those in particular who cause more injustice or exploit, who act knowingly and had better choices but chose not to make them. Now, all of this sounds quite abstract in the way that it's laid out, but hopefully I can add a bit more substance to it so it doesn't feel as abstract as I start talking you through. And I'm going to talk to you about age-based exploitation in the context of military conscription. So I'm just going to start with a quote that comes from Dalton Trumbo in Johnny Got His Gun. And it's, if the old men who make the wars fought them instead of the young, there wouldn't be any more wars. So Joe Bondman, he was 19 when he was enlisted to fight in the First World War. And during the battle, a shell exploded near him. And it just tore straight through his body. And when he regained consciousness in a hospital, he just found himself trapped in darkness. So his arms and legs were gone, his face was destroyed, he couldn't speak. So it was hear or see. Yet in his mind, he describes in the book that he felt used, that he felt exploited, that the young people and the young men that were with him, that were injured, the ones he lost, who were dying, this was all created by older politicians and those that did not fight. And he thought that this was like a grave wrong, that it was exploited in this way. And what I want to try and do is look at the act of conscription as an age-based exploitation. So conscription is often justified as like a patriotic duty or some kind of national necessity. But like I said, I want to argue that it's exploitative for young people. And when I refer to young people, I mean between the ages of 16 and 35. So within this age group, they're often socially and economically dependent. They're politically unrepresented. So they form a minority when it comes to democracies. And they're institutionally weak in terms of their voice having weight. So as a result of this, they're structurally disadvantaged, I want to argue, within existing institutions. And they lack opportunities to be able to contest these arrangements. So an implication is that if conscription exploits younger people of these age groups, it seems that the burdens of national defence should be distributed more fairly across age groups, if that is the case. So first of all, military conscription, it involves mandatory enlistment of citizens into the armed forces. And historically, like I said, it's been justified for national self-defence. And obviously, as an institution, it's just re-emerging globally. It's really gone more intense. So it's been reintroduced in Sweden, Latvia, Lithuania. There's proposals and it's been expanded in France, Germany, Italy, Serbia. It's been maintained in Cyprus, Denmark, Belarus, Estonia, Russia, Finland, Greece. And a referenda in Austria and Switzerland rejected proposals to abolish the draft as well. So it's really kicking in at the moment in terms of military conscription. So the justifications for conscription, they tend to be around a state's right to defend themselves against unjust aggression. And you can see this in a lot of just war theory. So the protection of individual rights, preservation of national sovereignty, enforcements of norms against aggression as well. And you even see this within John Rawls. So he argues that conscription can be justified when it's necessary for the security of liberty. So if we need to secure our freedom, then he thinks that obviously conscription can justify that in order to obviously help us maintain our rights to freedom. But in most societies that are practicing conscription, service is required between the ages of 18 and 26. And the reason for this is that young people are thought to be stronger, they're thought to be more capable. They're obviously at an age where they can be trained into military service as well, so the training's there. And then we also have exemptions for military service. And this often works to the favour of older individuals. So it might be professionals, those that are in higher education, those that have family responsibilities. And what this does is it creates this structural asymmetry through legal design in terms of who can be conscripted. So you've got mandatory conscription that can take place. So this often involves legal coercion. So examples of mandatory conscription are like Russia, Belarus, South Korea. And it's often, if you don't follow through, you can be subject to imprisonment or fines or various things like that. And there's also external conscription that's taking place now. So this was very recently, in particular with what's happening in the Ukraine, particularly with men as well, there was pressure on states to restrict the exile of draft eligible individuals during the war. So it was argued that if states had anyone from Ukraine that was of draft age, then they should be sent back. So that's very recently been put in. We also have things known as voluntary conscription, and obviously this is much more familiar to us, especially in Europe as well. So even voluntary systems, though, they target young people. So if you go to the UK, they recruit from as young as 16. And in particular, it's campaigns that are targeted in disadvantaged communities. So the military go into schools in areas where there's probably high levels of social deprivation or need. And they go into the high schools and they're encouraging them to join the military. And it's presented as a way out. It's a pathway to education, funding, job stability, career development, come and join us, we'll help you get out of this, basically. You also see this in the United States as well. So you have military incentives around financial aid, education funding, job security, and military programs in schools as well, so such as the cadets and career outreach. So you see lots of kind of recruitment for people actually very, very young. And what I want to try and look at in particular is the idea that it is using the model of exploitation that I described earlier, explain how conscription policies create vulnerability for younger cohorts or younger age groups. And in particular, this involves both voluntary conscription, but also mandatory as well. Then I want to identify the agents who exploit this vulnerability and just evaluate the moral responsibility of states and other actors as well. And what's important is also looking at it from a time dimension. If young people are exploited at an earlier age, what that then does and impacts them in the future as well. Right, okay, so first of all, just following the framework that I had earlier, the thing that's important to note or look for first of all is structural injustice in the background. And if that's there, and as I said, structural injustice can arise from an action or an omission. And I think conscription illustrates this dynamic. So state laws, they classify citizens by age. Young people become the bearers of military risk. Opting out is often legally restricted, but it can also be, if you're from a poorer background and this is being given to you as a route out, very often it's you've got limited alternatives in the background as well that are going on there that push you. Your options are restricted, which then leaves people joining the military or entering conscripted service as well. And the state both creates vulnerability through legal design. So if you have young people that are in disadvantaged backgrounds and they don't have opportunities, that's a design of the state. And it also limits the ability to refuse participation. So what you have is age-based vulnerability that is institutionally designed. So conscription is widely violated as well for violating negative liberty. So negative liberty includes things like freedom of movement, freedom of occupation, autonomy, and self-ownership. And it can interfere in these freedoms that people have by compelling individuals into military roles, forcing participation in some cases that involve lethal violence or punishment, and restricting the ability to refuse service. So this would constitute, in these kind of cases, a serious interference with basic liberties. But I also think there's an injustice because of age-based targeting. So conscription disproportionately targets young adults. This is at a critical stage when young people are forming their identities, they're pursuing education, they're planning future careers, and it restricts their liberty precisely when these opportunity sets are being formed. And I also think that it brings about these kind of distributive injustice and power asymmetries as well. So young people are performing dangerous roles, they're at the front line of combat, they can be exposed to injury, they've got risk of death. Meanwhile, the decision makers are the politicians, the military leaders, and the policymakers. And it's those that design these policies and ways of being are actually not the ones who fight them. You can also see relational inequality in the background structures as well. So relational egalitarianism as a principle of justice, it argues that justice requires that people be social equals. And conscription undermines this. So young citizens, they just become instruments of policy rather than equal participants in society. They face disproportionate risk, they have reduced agency, they don't really have the capacity to refuse, and older political actors remain protected from these risks. So what you have is this hierarchical system that's based on age, where you've got older generations retain their decision-making authority and younger generations who basically have to comply. You also have recruitment and economic vulnerability. So even if there isn't formal conscription, recruitment itself can create structural vulnerability. So as I mentioned before, in the United Kingdom, this is as young as 16 in which people are being recruited. And when they sign up to the military at age 16, they've got a few weeks in which to opt out. Once those few weeks have passed, they are then in the military till the age of 22, if they opt to sign into a military contract. And as I said, this is being advertised in economically deprived schools and disadvantaged communities. And this is particularly troubling because we do think in the UK in particular that 16-year-olds are too young to vote. So it seems really strange that they can sign this kind of binding contract that can hold them in an occupation until the age of 22 that's actually like a really dangerous occupation as well, that involves significant personal risk. So that seems like an issue. Now, against this, some people might argue that military service, it actually benefits youth. It benefits disadvantaged youth in particular, because what it provides is discipline, it provides training, it provides upward mobility. But the empirical evidence on this is actually really mixed. So it seems that veterans are not more likely to be employed, and when they are, it tends to be in low-skilled occupations. So military education programs have been criticised across the board for having educationally weak standards as well, and this comes from Child Soldiers International. There's also an issue or a defence of conscription that involves lifespan equality. So the argument is that everyone is young once and the burdens are equal over a person's lifetime. So this is the idea that actually everybody is young, and people when they are young go through a process of conscription, or they're there for a set period of time. But what's problematic about this kind of thinking about it is that harms associated with war, so say a war was to break out in the next few days, then you've got death, injury, trauma. These are not like distributed evenly across time. They occur at specific moments and they fall disproportionately on those who tend to be young at that particular moment in time. And historical evidence illustrates this clearly. So during World War I, you've got the average age of soldiers was between 19 and 22 years old. During World War II, conscription policy targeted school leavers. So these were really young, they were just fresh out of school. And those who died or suffered permanent injury during these conflicts, they never lived long enough to experience the supposed benefits that's later on in their lifespan. So what you do have is, if a war breaks out, you do have inequality across lifespan. So it's not true that just being burdened when you're young necessarily then reflects and falls away, because we all age and go through. So what you have is younger people face disproportionately higher risks of premature death, and lifetime equality, when that happens, it just breaks down. You've also got a democratic legitimacy objection as well. So someone might argue, actually, conscription, it's just democratically authorised. This is just something we all agree to as part of a democracy. But the problem that we have is democratic power is age skewed. The median voting age is 44.4 in the EU. In the USA, it's 47.5. And we find that politicians and political leaders are in their 60s, 70s and 80s. We also have issues within democratic systems that older voters vote more frequently, they possess greater resources, greater power, and they've got more influence on democratic institutions as well. So they just dominate the institutions. So what you end up with is younger citizens or younger people, they're a minority within democratic politics. So this makes it really difficult for them to prevent policies that actually are disproportionately burdening them. They don't have the voice that other age groups do have. So what I would say is the state creates structural injustice in the background by designing age-based conscription laws, concentrating military recruitment amongst disadvantaged youth, and also structuring political systems that are just dominated by older cohorts as well. So there's no way to contest this in the way that you'd want. So, but structural vulnerability alone doesn't constitute exploitation. So what I want to argue is exploitation occurs when actors benefit from the background injustice, and they do so when they are morally responsible for benefiting. So I'll just try and flesh this out. So what I want to say is conscription and military recruitment, they create a specific form of age group exploitation. So state laws and policies allow the instrumental use of young people in armed conflict in ways that leverage their structural vulnerability. And as I said, the vulnerability arises from age dependency, from economic pressure, limited political power, and also targeted recruitment. So what are the wrong-making features that we can see when it comes to age-based military exploitation? You have young people with limited alternatives. So you might have economic deprivation, educational inequality, and legal straits. You've got others that benefit from their labour and their risk exposure. You've got military institutions, state authorities, civil populations that rely on young people or young soldiers to carry out dangerous and morally demanding tasks. And these actors all benefit from the protection and security that the military service provides. And this relationship, it's morally asymmetrical. Young soldiers must, obviously, they bear most of the severe physical, psychological, and moral burdens of war. It can be quite traumatic if they have to kill somebody, if a war breaks out, while decision makers and beneficiaries of war are often insulated from these risks. And these exploitation occurs within unjust structural conditions. So young people typically do not control the broader social circumstances that shape their choices. And because they can't escape or significantly influence these conditions, their vulnerability actually becomes something that people can use, benefit, and exploit. And before I go into more detail on that and how that works, it's important to note that conscription can extract more than time or labour. So young soldiers are required to kill others, to witness extreme violence, and to potentially follow unjust orders. And this just creates a moral injury and psychological harm that's there. So being forced to commit violence can itself be a distinct moral harm that young people would be forced to bear. Now, I'm going to talk about the beneficiaries of these unjust structures. So the beneficiaries in particular are the corporate beneficiaries. So you have defence contractors such as Lockheed Martin, Boeing, RTX, BAO systems. These just generate enormous revenues from military equipment and revenues. So just to give you an example, Lockheed Martin, it's a little bit dated because you're kind of a year behind when you can get the stats on this. They gained 71 billion in 2024. RTX generated 80 billion. You've got BAE systems. They had profits exceeding 28 billion. So these corporations depend on the existence of military personnel who operate, maintain, and deploy their products. And the availability of young soldiers who are either recruited into the military or those that are obviously conscripted into the military, they become an economic input for the broader defence industry. And the sacrifices of young military personnel, they're just linked to this kind of corporate profitability. Then you've also got benefactors that are in the form of private military contractors, and this is just escalating hugely at the moment. So you've got companies such as, see if I can pronounce this correctly, Academy, DynCorp and Wagner Group. They are recruiting former soldiers into private security and combat roles. So they particularly target veterans. So when you look at veterans, sometimes they're like 26. that they're actually targeting. So they're not that old. So these are people who've recently left the military and are struggling with employment and financial stability. And what this state does is it almost acts as this pipeline. So it produces trained individuals who later become part of the labour force for private military services. Now, private military services, these salaries are higher than standard military wages. So this is often an argument they use. But the contracts are short term, and the legal protections that people have when they were in the military are very, very small in comparison when they work for a private military contractor. And the private military itself is just expanding hugely. So in 2020, the profits were 258 billion. It's due to reach 447 billion by 2028. So the money that comes from obviously arms manufacturers and private military contractors as well are just ginormous. And this growth, in order to work, they need trained individuals or those that are economically pressured just to perform like really dangerous security work. Then there's also civilian beneficiaries as well. So you have non-fighting civilians also benefit indirectly. They gain national security, territorial defence and social stability. But as I said, the burdens of war are concentrated on young people, and the protection for some depends on the risk borne by others, and these are younger age groups. So the key claim that I want to make is states, they don't merely allow this system, they're actually creating and sustaining the structural conditions that make younger age groups vulnerable. So you've got multiple actors that are benefiting from this system. You've got the state and military institutions, you've got defence corporations, you've got private contractors, and you've also got civilian populations as well. However, just benefiting from an injustice doesn't necessarily mean that you're exploiting younger people. So I think for us to be able to identify exploiters, we need to look at who's actually morally responsible for these arrangements as well. And I'm going to start by applying Jeff McMahan's theory of moral responsibility to see if it can shed some light on this or provide some answers. So as I mentioned before, moral responsibility, it exists on a spectrum. So agents may be more or less responsible depending on their role in a system. And the 4 criteria that he uses are causation, knowledge, reasonable alternatives, and proportionality. And then depending on where you hit on this, the degree of moral responsibility you have, that tracks into liability. And liability just means that you can say, actually, you are morally responsible for doing this. So if you're a corporation that is making lots of money out of arms and you're influencing the political system in terms of war, you can actually label it on them and say, look, it's you. It's not letting people off the hook saying this is all just background structural injustice. So the idea of moral responsibility is to pin it on people, or so I would hope. So first of all, let's look at the state responsibility. So in terms of causation or complicity, you might say that when states mandate conscription, requiring younger groups to bear the cost of war, older generations or older cohorts or age groups are shielded from the frontline risks. And this is like an indirect structural contribution. States also they shape vulnerability through limited welfare provision, unequal educational opportunities, restricted employment prospects, which means that some people are joining the military because that's the best option they have to relieve themselves of these conditions. So the military service can appear as one of the very few viable options for many young people. There's also the political structure as well. Younger citizens have less influence over policy, particularly in ageing democracies. So even when others exploit young soldiers, they do so within a structural framework that has been created and maintained by the state, by its laws, by its policies, how it's organised. When you look at reasonable alternatives to the state, you might say that moral responsibility increases if agents reasonably could have acted differently. So when you look at something like conscription, targeting young age groups for military service, it's not inevitable, it's not something we have to do. If we had a system where we're saying, right, okay, all the ones who are over 67, 68, you now need to go to war, you will be conscripted, and there was active recruitment of older generations or older people, we'd all be horrified, yet we just see it as a given when it's younger people. So there are different alternatives of actually sharing these kind of burdens without just necessarily targeting young people. So there could be broader distribution of defence burdens across society. You might have expanded education, employment and welfare support, and reduce the economic pressures that push people towards enlisting. So because reasonable alternatives exist for the state, or if reasonable alternatives exist for the state, then maintaining this youth-focused conscription, I think, increases their moral responsibility. We also have knowledge and foreseeability with the state. The stats are out there in terms of, we know what happens to young soldiers with people that enlist. They have disruptive education, they have mental health risks, they have poor post-service employment outcomes. All of these things are there for states to have a look at, and look at the empirical data on there. So they either know, or they should know, the dangers of just enlisting young people or recruiting young people into the military. So it seems that these harms are well documented and publicly known. So if in that kind of case, it seems really difficult for a state to claim ignorance. So maintaining youth-targeted conscription, despite evidence, constitutes a foreseeable harm. And again, this increases state responsibility. And then you can look at proportionality. So responsibility increases when the scale and the severity of harm are large. So if you apply this to conscription, young soldiers, they face risks of death, physical injury, psychological trauma, long-term economic disadvantage. And if this affects a large age group of people, a large group, then it's not isolated instances in which this is occurring. So it seems that the injustice is systemic, it's structural, it's not something that's accidental. So if the state has the authority and the capacity to change these arrangements, then the failure to do so just increases its moral responsibility, or the degree of moral responsibility and the degree of liability. And all that means is that you can say and look at the state's policy and actually say, this is something that's very wrong. You can hold the state to account. You can pinpoint what's going on here. You can have a look and see about actual exploiters. So does the state, creating this vulnerability amongst young people, then create the conditions for their exploitation? So exploiters as corporates, companies as well. So you've got the defence contractors. You can plug in the moral responsibility account to see if there's actually, do they know what they're doing? Are they causing this? Could they have reasonably done it otherwise? So what's important is these companies are not passive actors in the market. They actively shape defence policy through lobbying, political influence, partnership with government institutions. So they're helping to sustain or influencing the broader military structures that expose young people to this kind of harm. They're actually directly involved in this. So because corporations operate with full awareness, they could do otherwise, of the human cost of war, and they continue to prioritise military expansion, in some cases for profit, they occupy a very high position, I think, on the spectrum of moral responsibility. You could also look at exploiters as my private military contractors. With these companies, they frequently recruit soldiers who have limited employment opportunities after leaving the military. The individuals they recruit may face economic insecurity, psychological trauma, limited educational opportunities. So it seems that if the private military companies are transforming these vulnerabilities into an economic resource, by recruiting veterans for dangerous security policy operations, then it seems that there's something problematic about this. They're actually targeting people that are very, very vulnerable. And although these contracts may promise higher wages, the actual contract terms, like if you think of how many billions these contractors are earning, they're on insecure short-term contracts with very limited protections if they end up being injured in war, for example. So that seems problematic in terms of the contract terms, and it creates this cycle of vulnerability. So the state recruiting and acting as it does, targeting young people or getting young people into conscription, they then leave, that then makes them vulnerable in the future. So it's looking long term to these kind of private military contractors as well. And then you also can look at it in terms of civilians as well, and consider the role of non-fighting civilians. Civilians, obviously, they don't directly conscript or deploy the soldiers, but they may still benefit from the protection and stability that has been secured from the sacrifices of young people. And when you're looking at civilians, it's really tricky in terms of like looking at moral responsibility and how that would work amongst civilians. But I guess one thing is, if civilians contribute to a system, they possess knowledge of the harms involved and they have reasonable alternatives available to stop it, and don't, then it seems that there is a degree. It's obviously nothing like the degree that you'd look at with some of the private corporations, but there is a degree to which citizens are morally responsible and can be held to a degree for this, even if it's just a small degree. And I think it's important to recognise that we don't just want people to say, oh, it's the system. Actually, there are things that we can do to try and help get rid of the unjust background structures. So I think what McMahan's framework allows us to do is look at the different actors and the different roles and see if we can differentiate moral responsibility and see actually who's doing wrong, who is an exploiter, and just that you're not just in the system and benefiting from injustice without the capacity to do anything about it. So it allows us to differentiate where people are. So taken together, this analysis, what I hope it shows is that multiple actors contribute to the exploitation of young age groups in systems of military conscription. These include state institutions, military organisations, private defence contractors, private military companies as well. And in some cases, there might also be civilian beneficiaries. And what distinguishes these actors is not like whether they participate in a system, but the degree of moral responsibility that they can bear. And if we focus on these kind of conditions, we can identify how responsibility and liability are distributed across actors as well. So it helps to reveal the structural mechanisms that are at play. And this is just the final slide. Importantly, youth-targeted conscription is not the only way to organise defence. States could distribute defence obligations more broadly across age groups, or rely more heavily on professional volunteer forces, or reduce the economic pressures that push some people into enlistment. And I think without these kind of alternatives, it does look like the state's responsibility for creating exploitative conditions increases when they're not there. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this, unfortunately, timely talk. We're now in the question and answer period. As usual, we have an audience online and an audience here. And if you're here, put up a hand for a new question, a finger for following up to somebody, and we file the following up question before. And for you online, you write it in the Zoom's chat if you want to ask a new question or a follow-up. And please also tell me about your area of research. We like to file questions from different fields. I think the absolute fastest and quickest here was Eva.
Thank you so much. This was super interesting. So, about the last, I have 3 questions about the last slide.
3 questions.
Yes, but very quick.
It can be 4 too.
So the last slide, you said we can rely on to find alternatives on voluntary forces. But I thought when you brought that up before that it's even more unjust to have a voluntary, because then you target disadvantaged groups. So it's mandatory seems more just. But then a second question was, would it make sense to make a distinction between exploitation of a group X, say, in a sense, where in the case where everyone becomes X sometimes in life, like in military service. So then compared to a case where that is not true. So in military, so we can say that, yeah, but those who are 45 now, they did military service. Would that make a moral difference? And then I was just curious about McMahon's 4 criteria. Did all of them have to be fulfilled somewhat? To some, I know it's a gradual thing, but still, can we have 3 of them and still moral responsibility?
Yeah, I'll explain that one through. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Ava. So in terms of voluntary, I guess where I was coming from with that, the quote was a bit quick. What I meant is if we have the right background conditions in place, so that people aren't doing it out of like economic necessity, or they just have nothing else that they can do, that this seems a viable option, then I think it feels not as bad when you have that, with people choose to enlist in the military in those kinds of cases. And people might choose to enlist for all kinds of reasons to do with state self-defense. They actually might want to like protect people, they might want to protect their loved ones, but it feels very different from someone being forced to do it, or someone doing it because they don't have anything else that they can do. They don't feel like they can read or get a job anywhere else, that they're then turning to that. So that's where I was coming from. I was hoping the background conditions would be fixed to a degree with that. In terms,
is that quick to see if I understand this? So you have different background conditions when you have a voluntary system than the background condition you described for general conscription. That doesn't seem to be a fair comparison.
Say that again, sorry.
No, when you asked this question, said, if it's a kind of but the background conditions are fair, then it's okay.
But then we can do other things as well.
Exactly, and then we can have fair background conditions for general conscription too.
For general conscription, I think it's for general conscription, it feels like even if you have fair background conditions for general conscription, it's when you're targeting one age group that I find problematic, or for it to be targeting you.
You should go back to that.
I'll come back to that.
Sorry.
The second one, is this relating to your second question? Was it that it doesn't matter if over a lifetime everybody's done conscription at some point, then it seems fair?
Yeah, I was wondering if that...
Yeah, was that a thing? So I think probably what I was thinking of with that, what I find troubling about that is some people can do the military conscription and be conscripted, and they can do like maybe a year or 2 and they've fulfilled their purpose. But if war breaks out on your watch, like that, it's just random, isn't it, in time, in terms of when that could happen. Actually, what you're going to have to face and what you're going to have to do at that point in time, whether you're going to have to kill somebody, whether your life's at risk, all of that you go through, that's an extraordinary burden to bear. And it just feels like it shouldn't necessarily be on just who happens to be in that age group at that moment in time, and everybody else is off the hook. It feels like there should be, if war breaks out, maybe something different should be put in there that makes it a little bit fairer, where it just doesn't all fall on one group. And I guess the best way of saying that is if war breaks out and we suddenly had a policy which says, look, anybody who's over 70 has lived their life already. They've already had, why would we have it where it's the ones who are 18 to 26 who are fighting? And if we rolled that out, it'd feel a little bit like, what? Like if everybody did it. So it does feel like a little bit random how we pick these age groups and go with it like that. So I just think when war hits, the burden is just too much. And then there's lots of people that don't do anything and they get off. And your fourth question was the criteria. Then you don't have to hit all of them, but there might be a lesser degree if you don't necessarily hit one. So one of them that seems particularly important is, like, say for example you have knowledge of a situation, you were causally implicated in some respect, but you had no reasonable alternative. There's a small degree that you might be morally responsible and held to account, just a little bit, but obviously it would increase if you had a reasonable alternative and chose not to do anything about it. So it just depends. So you can hit different criteria to different levels, but the degree obviously changes depending on which criteria you hit and to what extent would be the way that it worked. Is that okay? Thank you.
Just quick follow up with a question of clarification, because I don't know the system in Great Britain, but at least when we had the system before, I mean, you stayed as a reserve in the armed forces to 45 or 50.
And you had to be called through.
Yeah, so then everybody's there. It doesn't seem to be unjust expectation.
No, it doesn't seem as bad if you're in reserve, but then it also feels like you're in reserve. And there are lots of exceptions to these rules that are applied across the board. So it will be, if you've got a family, you go down the, like your chances of being enlisted go down. If you're in higher education.
We didn't go down for doing our reserve.
Did you not do anything like that? No. So you have no exemptions in Sweden at all?
I'm sure there are some exemptions if you're bad health and stuff like that.
No exemptions.
Who said that?
Ludwig.
Okay, Ludwig knows better than me. He's what we call... I'm not going to say.
Well,
Did you want to come in here, Ludwig? No. Okay.
That seems a little bit fairer, but it still feels like the initial burden when war breaks out is on young people. It still feels that you're in reserve if things go wrong and they've all died, or you need, like this is still young. No.
Let's send the microphone back there. There seems to be some kind of... Where's the microphone? Oh, it's Eva hugging it.
Do you want to?
No, do it.
So the Swedish system is that you are enlisted into training.
Yeah.
And then once you are krigsplacerad, what's that?
Exploited?
No.
You're assigned to military units.
You're assigned to military duty or something like that. But then all of them are basically in the reserve, unless you voluntarily choose to become a professional.
So if
but
war breaks out, you're all called. It's not just
all are called.
Okay.
Finland is extreme in that respect still.
That sounds
47 for the military and 70 for the civil defense.
Okay. Well, that seems like a much fairer system, I think. Then it's more that when it's concentrated on young people, it feels very problematic. So it doesn't seem quite as troubling if it's everyone can be called in at the same point. If war breaks out, that doesn't seem as...
We call that total defense.
Total defense.
Everybody's involved in the war effort.
Maybe we should add that the system in those days were just for men.
Yeah.
Oh, were they? Right, okay.
Now we have the same
So we
system.
were
No, I was
exploited
going to
by
say
women.
it's not now.
But we have very few people that are conscripted.
Yes, but the system is the same.
Okay, let's go back to the... Eva, were you satisfied? We kind of disrupted your question. Then next on the list is the guy who knows everything about the military in Sweden, Ludwig.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Nikki, for excellent presentation. Just one comment and one question. I think my comment is that I wasn't sure always in your presentation whether you were addressing the exploitations inherent to age-based conscription under ideal conditions or as conditions in different countries, because some of the problems you identify, such as lobbying by corporate actors in the US, for instance, well, that is surely not a sort of feature of the way in which we could organize age-based conscription. So, so I wonder if your argument is directly want to show that age-based conscription is necessarily unjust, or where it's just unjust under certain conditions today. But then my real question was about democratic legitimacy. You very shortly addressed that, and it seemed that your argument was just that, well, young people are in a minority and they will be voted out by the old people. But I'm not sure that's enough, actually, to show that it's democratically illegitimate to impose disadvantages that are asymmetric on different kind of age groups. And moreover, I'm not sure what you mean by democratic legitimacy, because, I mean, a common usage of that term is to say that, well, if you have a kind of democratic procedure and that is kind of provide everyone with sort of equal opportunities to exercise sort of influence, then you have a right also to make decisions that are wrong within a certain limit. So the democratic legitimacy doesn't necessarily have to show that all the decisions are fair or just. It's just that some unjust decisions will nevertheless be legitimate if they are produced by a democratic procedure. And I guess in that case, you might say that, well, it's exploitive, it is wrong, but it's still legitimate. You could actually have that kind of argument.
No, thank you. In terms of, I'll go with the first question. So the first one is age-based conscription like problematic full stop, or is it problematic on the ground? I would say the way that I've been looking at it is, I think it doesn't, when you describe the Swedish system there, where you go through maybe you have 2 years where you're conscripted and you have 2 years where you do the training and then you're on a reserve, that doesn't necessarily feel like age-based, because it encompasses a lot. If it goes all the way up to 70 as well. So it doesn't feel like I'm going to be saying that, oh, that's age-based conscription. That feels like something else. That feels like actually it's all ages that are involved in that process. It's just the initial training takes place when you're like 18 to 20. And that doesn't feel the same. I think there's just too many different age groups, and actually that seems like a much fairer way to do it. When I've been looking at it as problematic, it is when it is a particular age group that gets either it's conscription or being recruited in a very young age. So in the UK, I find it really disturbing that people are 16 and being recruited in, but only from certain backgrounds. Like the military aren't in the private schools, they aren't, it's just certain kids in certain backgrounds that are targeting. I find that problematic when it's recruitment in that way, and that happens in the States as well. So I guess what I'm looking at is when it's conscription, it's a particular like criteria that a country would have to fulfill, and I have been all sweeping because I listed at the very beginning all the different countries that have conscription, and it looked like they were the target, but I was just showing that actually this is relevant. Like it's not something that's necessarily like where each one is a target for every single thing. But I do think that if you target young people only, there isn't a reserve list, or there's a reserve list where people come in after the young people have all got in trouble. I think that's problematic to have conscription of that age-based range. I do think that's troubling to do that, because the burden that will fall on that group at that time is just really hard. I think it's too much. So yes, I'm against age-based conscription in the way that I've set it up, but not in the way you replied with Sweden, if that makes sense to you guys. So yeah, thank you. Democratic legitimacy. Yeah, I think you're right on that. I think that's a fair comment. I think I was just looking at the democratic systems as they are and just finding it really problematic that young people don't have any means of contesting. So if they are a victim of injustice, so I don't just look at it in terms of military service. There's like, I just picked this example because it was relevant. There's lots of different types that I look at. So like the gig economy. And I think when young people don't have a means to try and change a system that's making them be victims of injustice in that way, I find that problematic. But my terminology, I think you're correct to pull me up on that. So thank you.
Well, happy with that. A follow-up question or a new question? Okay, so you're on the list, I think. So, and Ludwig was satisfied. So then we jump on to Karim Yabari.
Thank you. So yeah, thanks for this talk. It was very interesting. So I have two just questions that I want to understand this better. So first of all, why is conscription intertemporal? I understand why it's intergenerational, but it seems like the exploitation is happening at a given moment.
Yeah.
And the other one is, so you said that part of the definition of exploitation is that it's consensual.
Yeah.
But conscription is not consensual; it's coercive.
Yeah.
So why is it exploitation and not I don't know what you would call it? Unfree labor or
Okay.
Those two questions.
So consensual. Yeah, so the reason that I've looked at it in terms of intertemporal is it's looking at it over a lifetime as well. So it's looking at what impacts young people in particular when they are exploited when they're young, and whether that disappears, which it can. So it's looking at it over time and what our structures do over time. And if somebody is a victim of exploitation when they are young, very often that compounds over time. So it's not just when you're looking at age group exploitation that it's something at that given age group. It's looking how that works over time and the impacts that can have. So that's the reason I say it's intertemporal in that way. So you may think that's a mistake or I'm using like dodgy terminology there, but that's the way I've been understanding it. That it's just looking what happens, like the scarring effects, or whether you become more vulnerable and then others that don't. So I think it's really interesting to have a look at the different dynamics at play. When I talked about consent, so the best way to explain consent with exploitation, it can be where you're your circumstances are incredibly restricted, where you don't have many options that's there. And if you think of something like if you sign for life-saving surgery, you don't have many options. Your back is against the wall, but you still want it, or you still want to do it. It's the best you can get. And I think when you look at something like conscription or young people signing up for the military, that's their best option. Or if it's conscription, it might be the case that they want to look after their family, or they want, like it might be that's in there. Or if it's going to war, it might be the case that they think, actually, I want to protect my family, I want to do this, it's the option I've got. So it's that kind of like agency in restricted option sets that I was looking at when I was thinking of it in that way. So there is some kind of, because very often with exploitation that differentiates it from, so if you're a victim, say, of a theft, you put a gun to my head, you move me from my status quo to another situation in which I'm worse off, and I don't want it. So if you take my phone, it'd be like, no, I don't. But sometimes with exploitation, what tends to happen or can happen is actually you do, because it's the best option. Like if you're in a sweatshop you're working in Bangladesh, you definitely don't want to say, oh, please don't employ me. That makes your option sets worse. That's the best they can get, they compete for it. And it's that kind of limited option consent that I was playing into with that, or what exploitation theorists think of it in that way when they do. Does that still sound problematic and more like slavery, domination?
Well, I suppose that, I don't know, it feels like your argument might be more describing situations in the US where you have a voluntary system,
Yeah.
and that contains all the problems that you've listed, like vulnerable people, propaganda, etc. So that would be, I think, maybe a clear case of exploitation. But if you take, for example, the situation in some parts of Ukraine where people are, dragooned into a car by masked men, that doesn't seem like exploitation.
Yeah.
That seems like, I don't know, kidnapping and
Forced
labor.
labour. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay.
But with regard to the first point, I think that makes absolutely sense. And it reminds me of some discussions there's been about exploitation in the labor market, where you're put in in working conditions that undermine your health, but that health impact appears much later in life. For example, there were these people in the US that got exposed to asbestos, and they got cancer after 30 years and so. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's great. And just on that last point as well, like some of the exploitation accounts, when they just look at it at a moment in time, if they were to say, well, there's no harm, that gets missed because they've only looked at harm in that moment. They've not looked at harm as a problem later on, or what's going to happen. So that's the reason for that. Yes, exactly that. Thank you.
Very good. Your turn. You need a microphone.
Thank you. Greetings. I'm doing human rights masters in University of Gothenburg, and thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. As you've mentioned, this injustice has a deep historical roots in World War II, and I bet it started even earlier as well. And it got me thinking in parallel with the democratic revolutionary movements in different countries, because at the forefront, in the front lines, there are young people, more or less, with the similar age groups that get killed, detained in terms of ratio, the numbers. So could we say that it's because it's not necessarily forceful and exploitatory from their end, but then on the other hand, I guess the social pressure or psychological pressure, we can call that, is so high. So could we compare that in that sense?
Possibly. Who would be the exploiter if that was the case, do you think? So who would be the beneficiary that you might
that's the
pay
thing,
for?
because we can't think of necessarily specific institution. I get it's purely social pressure coming on them.
Pressure, yeah. I'd have to look at it, I think, and see if it would fit. But just because I've got that criteria doesn't necessarily, there might be another criteria that might plug into, I think. I'd just have to look at the case and see. So.
That. Okay, then we move on to Tim. You can get a microphone there.
Oh, all right.
just a couple of thoughts. So one is just a quick follow-up on something Kareem asked about your conditions, the conditions that you laid out for exploitation. Maybe I can ask you to clarify. I didn't take those conditions to be definitional of exploitation.
No,
so
they're
I think,
definitely not. No.
Okay.
I borrow them.
So you can recognize, for example, instances of exploitation where the person being exploited doesn't benefit or doesn't volunteer or anything like that. So you can have a pretty expansive definition of exploitation.
Yeah, but I just think the moral responsibility one is really good when you've got, particularly if you're using a structural account of exploitation. And what tends to happen with structural accounts is people get off the hook quite a lot because they say, oh, it's just the social structures. And I think definitely within the exploitation literature, there's more of a movement towards looking at power. So actually who can move within those? And I think what you can do is I want to be able to say the morally responsible and liable if you behave that way and you've got power within a system. So if you're like a multinational corporation in the supply chain and you've got power to change what's going on there, it would be really nice to be able to say you're morally responsible and liable. And I think Jeff's system, where it's degrees of moral responsibility and liability, I think even though it applies in ethics of killing and it's a different framework, the way that he uses it, I think it's really neat to pick up and play with it in that way and see if it can do some work.
Okay, so my question was going to be about that that specific point. So Jeff introduces these conditions for liability in the context of defense, right? So he has this notion of being liable to something, right? So if you're responsible for a threat of wrongful harm and you meet certain conditions, then you're liable to proportionate defensive harm, right? I was curious about what work, do these conditions do a similar kind of work in your application? Like you're talking about the state, right?
Yeah.
Do you think the state is liable to something? If so, like what is it? Exactly.
Liable to. I think it's liable to make changes or to admit, that there's a wrong being done, or it gives it movement to hold people to account. So it's not liable where you're liable in the sense of you're liable because of these actions to death or something like that in the way that Jeff uses them, but it's more that you're liable to prompt a reaction. So liability typically is like you're liable in terms of like you've got different versions of liability, like strict liability. What I'm trying to do is use it in a really loose sense that you can be held to account for it because there's a degree to which you're morally responsible. And it's just being able, it's really simple in that way. So it's not doing the work that Jeff does in that at all. In the way that he does with ethics of killing, it's much more loose, it's much softer.
Okay.
But it
so
is being able to hold people to account.
Where being held to account in this case would mean we can hold the state accountable for making certain changes.
Yeah.
Is that that's the idea?
To instigate a response, I think, that needs to be made, not just that you can, it's almost like being able to say, look, the state's hands aren't clean. Like you can't say, you've not done anything wrong to some extent in that. If you've made a group vulnerable, where they're vulnerable to exploitation or vulnerable to harm, particularly if you look at something like with the gig economy or something like that, I think it's really nice to be able to pin it on the state for bringing those conditions about, but also the actors involved who are there. There's a degree to which some might be more responsible than others, that you can hold them to different levels or degrees of accountability to make changes. So if somebody's like hitting quite high, the changes or what's required would be more demanding than if it was low, and you can't really do much about it. So it's trying to track that, and particularly like the model, the way that it's trying to work is looking at future generations as well. So like looking at the state's role in making different groups vulnerable at different points in time. And being able to hold the state to account for that once you can track it. So.
Okay.
With that, is that a follow-up? No, new question. Okay. So then we have Erik Brandstedt online.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very interesting. I really like the overall account. I think it's thought-provoking and makes a good contribution to the debate. I can actually disclose that I also reviewed your paper for political studies on this topic, and I really enjoyed it at that point.
Were you reviewer 2 or reviewer 1? Which one were you?
Sorry,
Reviewer 2 or
reviewer
1?
number 2, of course. Yeah, no, yeah, yeah. But I have 2 questions. The first perhaps relates to what Ludwig asked about. So I wonder if the problem here is that there is something, or let's say, I mean, to me it seems that there is a way of kind of impartially justifying why young age groups should take the main brunt of the responsibility of defending the country, being enrolled in the military. But I wonder, and that is because they have greater abilities than older age groups. So I wonder then is it something about kind of the nature of singling out young age groups for this risk that is exploitative, or is it how it's been actually carried out with like unfair wages and recruitment campaigns targeting vulnerable populations? Or let's say if all of these conditions were improved, would it still be exploitative if that was the case, that the young was mainly responsible for being in the military? And then second question kind of follows up on your response to this argument from lifespan equality. So you said that it's still unfair because it may be that, so if we have kind of as a society impartially arrived at the view that the young age groups they will take this risk defending the country, but that will be kind of evened out because or there is a kind of indirect reciprocity such that when they are older, their descendants, the younger descendants, will do the same for them. So they can be justified in that sense. But then you say, well, some age groups or some cohorts may be unlucky in the sense that war breaks out when they are young, and that's the unfairness. Can one not then argue in response to that to mitigate that there is a kind of an unfortunate consequence, but then what the response is that they have a justified claim to some kind of compensation for being unlucky in having to carry out this defense duty when they were young. So on the basis of that, they have a claim to compensation that kind of evens out their lifespan equality. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the being kind with my article as well. It's very much appreciated. I'll start with the last one. So when you were talking about how it's unlucky if war breaks out and whether you could be compensated, if you're dead, like you can't be compensated. You know, like the extreme of what we're asking people to do if war breaks out and it's on their watch is asking them to kill other people. That's really, it's just, can you compensate that enough for the truth? Like, I think if I was asked to kill someone, I'd find that like destroying. I'd find that really, really, really hard. And that is what we're asking people to do. So it's whether there could be compensation that would make up for that. I'm not so sure. If it all falls on them, if that's their burden, where older generations say, oh, well, we'll send you out, we've done our bit and we didn't get hit. But if you make it back, we'll give you some compensation. It feels a little bit cruel, especially if you lose your friends or you've got all of that going on. It's quite a traumatic thing. And in particular, I've read a book, which is by ex-soldiers that have written about this idea of like what it means to commit an injustice. Victor Tadros has got some work on this as well, and it just feels like the trauma that you'd actually put young people through or people through on their own isn't something that could necessarily be compensated. In terms of if we got rid of all of the background injustice in terms of poverty, educational equality and all of those things, would that somehow make targeted age conscription okay? I think if it's only going to fall on a particular age group, so between say 18 and 26 only, and it was always like that was the age group that it was going to fall on, I think even if the background condition was okay, I still think that's problematic. I think if it was a much more expansive age group that went into the 40s or went into into the 70s where people are contributing, it doesn't feel like it's young people on their own doing all the work. It just feels like such a big burden to ask them to do, and especially when a lot of the decisions to go to war or what's happening isn't something that they've had any control over or any say in. So it could be that the war that they're being asked to fight, they might disagree with it, so they might not want to be part of that in the first place. So yeah, I think if it depends on if it's a narrow expansion of age group rather than going across a few different ones, that feels problematic even if there is no injustice in the background. Does that answer the questions? Thank you.
On that point, join me in thanking Nicola for this lovely talk and discussion.
Thank you.
It will go on, I'm sure.
Thank you very much.
And just next 11th of March, we're going to have a great talk by Ludwig Beckmann, long-time fellow at the Institute. Polarization and the limits of partisan loyalty. Polarization, yeah, exactly that. And then 18th of March is Stephanie Planty, who's going to talk about confidence and aspiration, the conundrum of students' optimistic outlooks in educational inequalities. And on 25th of March, we have Ulrika Winblad. She hasn't said what she's going to talk about, but she is a professor at the Public Health and Caring Sciences Department in Uppsala. So probably something in that area. You're welcome.